What are some historical lies that people generally believe? NGT. My favorite lie is ultra. NGT. NGT. It's not really just one lie. It's a campaign of lies, probably more widespread and deep-rooted than any in history, all leading to one colossal lie, hiding the fact that the Allies broke the Enigma cipher. And, later, the Japanese Purple cipher, and the German Lorentz cipher, and the Italian C38 cipher. NGT. NGT. Basically, the Allies had blown every code the Axis used out of the water, thanks to the work of the Polish Cipher Bureau, and the Bletchley Park mathematicians including Alan Turing, and the American Signal Intelligence Service. NGT. NGT. The collective intelligence from all these broken codes was called Ultra. NGT. NGT. But what do you do when your code gets broken? You make a new, harder one. The Allies couldn't let that happen. They couldn't let the Axis know that their codes were broken. So how do you use data from a broken code without revealing that the code is broken? You lie. If they wanted to take out an Axis supply ship after finding it through Ultra, they didn't just do that. They had a spy plane fly over where they knew the ship would be, then they sunk it. So the crew are all like, oh shit, we got spotted. They also had to hide the broken codes from their own soldiers, lest they be revealed under careless talk. So they sent out other spy planes knowing nothing would be found, so crews wouldn't wonder how mission found an enemy every time. NGT. NGT. They would never attack until they had a cover story. Men undoubtedly died by attacks the government knew were coming, because they would not compromise Ultra. NGT. NGT. One of the few times they were forced to sink ships immediately, they covered it by sending a message in a code they knew the Germans had broken, to a spy in Naples, congratulating him of his success. The spy didn't exist, but the Germans intercepted the message and assumed everything was still good with Enigma. NGT. NGT. The best part is, they didn't even reveal Ultra after the war. They saw to it that the Enigma machines were sold to potential enemies in the Third World, who continued to use the broken codes for years. Ultra wasn't revealed in its full extent until 1974, 29 years after the war. Never has a secret of such massive importance been so well kept for so long. Salieri and Mozart actually got along quite well. If they did have a rivalry, it was merely professional. Salieri didn't promise his chastity to God, or if he did, he didn't follow through because he got married and had kids. Salieri didn't have to manipulate the emperor to earn favor with him. He was a well-respected composer, and one of the richest men in the country at the time. Amadeus is a great film, but it's a good thing that it doesn't start with based on a true story. At least it's honest. I'm looking at you, Braveheart. That Cleopatra was some sort of otherworldly beauty who mesmerized every man she met. Ancient historians were more impressed/scandalized by her intelligence and ability to manipulate as easily as she breathed, and it wasn't until centuries later that she began to develop this reputation as a sexy seductress. Cleopatra's ancestors were big fans of incest. The 16 roles of her great-great-grandparents were filled by just 6 individuals, and members of the Ptolemaic dynasty had a reputation for being odd-looking. Cleopatra, reportedly, was above average looking compared to others in her family, but according to historians like Plutarch, the general consensus was that her beauty was in itself not altogether incomparable, nor such as to strike those who saw her. That Marie Antoinette proclaimed "let them eat cake." In reality, it seems to have emerged from a short anecdote in an autobiography published by French, edit, Genevan-born, philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau and is frequently misattributed to her. NASA spent millions on developing a pen for space. The Russians used a pencil. Suggesting NASA isn't very intelligent, they were perfectly correct to make a pen for space. A pencil would have released loads of tiny graphite particles during use, which would float around and interfere with electronics. That the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD and then it was the Dark Ages. In reality, a peasant living through 476 probably wouldn't have realized they were living through the end of one age and the start of another. The beginnings of feudalism had already started back during Diocletian's reign. Barbarians' war bands and barbarian Roman troops had been a fact of life for generations. The barbarian king who deposed Augustulus still considered himself a rightful representative of the empire, etc. In some ways, the fall of Rome was sudden and traumatic. The population of Rome itself absolutely cratered in the 400s, after all, but it was really more of a gradual, centuries-long transition than a fall. Einstein got straight A's in school. They probably only say it to make kids feel better about themselves. That Iceland was named Iceland by the Vikings to try to trick colonists into not colonizing, when in fact the reason is that when the first people landed on Iceland it was winter and the Viking that named it saw a lot of ice and promptly named it as such. Almost anything involving the Library of Alexandria. No, the Library of Alexandria was not the sole repository of knowledge in the ancient world. There were many other great libraries such as the one in Pergamum, as well as many other collections. No, we did not lose countless important works that could only be found there. The library worked on copying works, and any important writings could easily be found in other libraries around the world. No, we wouldn't be living in a utopia if it didn't burn, because it was the center of learning. The library was in serious decline for almost a century before it burned. When Ptolemy VIII banned all foreign scholars from Alexandria, they moved to other libraries, and as Ptolemaic rule became less stable and the position of head librarian became a political position, the prestige of the library faded. No, Julius Caesar did not burn it down on purpose. While he was besieged in Alexandria, his troops set fire to some ships on the docks and the fire accidentally spread. However, it is unsure of how much of the library was truly destroyed, as we know the Malsion survived, and at any rate we know much was rebuilt later, with Mark Antony supposedly gifting some 200,000 scrolls to the library, and Claudius built an additional to it during his reign. No, the Christian Crusaders did not burn down the library because they hated knowledge. First of all, they didn't even attack Alexandria during the major crusades, they would during a later minor one. Besides, they would be almost 1,000 years too late, as the last recorded evidence of the library dates back to the middle of the 3rd century, and any vestiges of the library, which would have been a minor shell of its height as Roman and Greek scholarship had long moved to other centers. At any rate, what remained would have been destroyed during either Aurelian's attack of the city in 272 CE or Diocletian's in 297 CE. Removed. That Napoleon was short, he was of average height by those times. French just used the different scale of measurement. That George Washington had wooden teeth. That the Soviets had 1 rifle per 7 men. They in fact had a lot of small arms to share with the troops. And it's actually surprising that people believe this, at least to me. No, burning the Library of Alexandria didn't set humanity back by 1,000 years. Charlemagne would not have been the first person on the moon if it had remained intact. Nero probably did not fiddle while Rome burned. This is just one of many rumors that Tacitus and other Roman historians list as circulating at the time of the Great Roman Fire. Nero wasn't even in Rome at the time, he was at a private estate on the coast. He may have performed for an audience there, but he certainly didn't even know that Rome was on fire until several days later. News spread a lot slower in those days. After Nero knew that Rome was on fire, he set out immediately to Rome and put together a fire brigade to save people and property. He then paid millions of sesterces out of his own pocket to rebuild much of the city. However, people wanted a scapegoat for the fires. This fell on 2 groups, Nero and the people close to him, and ethnic minorities, especially Christians. So rumors circulated that Nero set the fire intentionally, that he sang while Rome burned, etc. Nero responded to this by supporting and spreading rumors that Christians were the cause of the fire, and apparently killed and tortured many. Ooh, I've got one. So we all know World War II and the Battle of Bulge? If you know that, you gotta know the Siege of Bastogne when the 101st Airborne were surrounded by the German troops. During the siege, the German commander requested a surrender from General Anthony McAuliffe of the besieged Americans, and he supposedly gave a fairly witty and comical first reply: "Nuts." Well, that wasn't his first response, this is a sanitized retelling. General McAuliffe's first response was tell the German commander to go fuck himself. There's just something special about generals telling each other to go fuck themselves. Okay, so, we have known for years that Greco-Roman statues and buildings were painted rather than them being just plain white marble, but we actively fucking ignored it. So when people found old Greco-Roman statues, they did notice staining from paint on some statues but ignored it because white marble was so beautiful and by the Renaissance was pretty much a symbol of Rome, and thus, civilization. Early art historians basically said they were meant to be white because white bare marble was more beautiful despite evidence of paint. When statues were found from ancient Greece and Rome, the remaining paint was washed off, and even the Parthenon had obvious evidence of paint on it up until the 18th century. Even historical texts from the time talk about painted buildings, and the discovery of Pompeii showed a Roman Empire that was much more colorful than people wanted to admit. So fast forward to the late 20th century when, after admitting amongst themselves that statues were likely painted, announced to the world in a big way that the statues were painted. A museum made a replica of Augustus of Prima Porta, which they painted to the best evidence they had, and the public hated it, with one art critic comparing it to a drag queen. Even when faced with the truth, people didn't merely reject it, they went against it. It got so bad that white nationalists sent death threats to art historians for stating that Greco-Roman statues were painted bright colors because it went against their image of ancient European civilization. So paleontologists might get flack for feathered dinosaurs, but at least they don't get death threats from white nationalists. That Viking helmets had horns on them. Like WTF, who the hell would think it was a good idea to place two objects that are easy to grab on your protective gear? It's like asking to get necked or stabbed. BTW, here is a real Viking. That knights in plate mail were big, slow, clunky bruisers. In reality, plate armor is actually easier to move around in than what we think of in video games as medium armor like chainmail. Why? Because it's fitted to the wearer and held on with a complex collection of straps and belts. This distributes the weight evenly across the body. In comparison to chainmail, or samurai o yoroi, which often comes up when this is mentioned, this is far more comfortable as the others put weight straight on the arms and shoulders. In a similar vein, padded or cloth armor is often portrayed in games as the lowest form of protection, but a properly made gambeson of such is actually surprisingly good protection. The layers of tough textile, often stitched so the weave is going in different directions each layer, actually can really stagger a slashing blow. Gillette invented the idea of women shaving their pits and legs, and no one removed body hair before then. Yet they never acknowledged things like sugaring, waxing, plucking, and threading that goes back hundreds of years. Hair removal goes all the way back to our caveman days. Our ancestors of all genders removed body, facial, and even head hair during warmer months using sharpened stones and shells, pitch from trees to rip it out at the roots, or rubbing it off with pumice stones or handfuls of sand. This prevented parasite infestations and skin infections. In the Renaissance, European women plucked their eyebrows and hair along the forehead to make their foreheads appear bigger so people would think they had larger brains and therefore were smarter. Victorians wanted to be as pure as marble statues, which meant removing all body hair. So yes, all genders of middle and upper class Victorians went full Brazilian. So all Gillette do was make it easier to remove your body hair. They didn't invent it. That Henry VIII divorced his fourth wife Anne of Cleves because she was ugly, or that he was deceived by a flattering portrait only to be disappointed in real life. When Anne first arrived in England, Henry thought it would be romantic to disguise himself when meeting her for the first time, so when he attempted to kiss her she had no idea it was the king, so she pulled away stunned and frightened. Henry's ideas of a chivalric first meeting ended in humiliation, so he would have taken an instant dislike to her for damaging his ego. Also, there is no evidence to suggest that Holbein's portrait of Anne was not a true likeness. Holbein's talents continued to be praised throughout Henry's reign. It is more likely that he was trying to cover up his embarrassment at their disastrous first meeting, by stating that she was not what he expected, or that he was convinced she wasn't a virgin, that ancient Greeks and Romans were super gay, or super okay with homosexuality. The first and most important point is that they did not conceive of sexuality in any way similar to how we do. They didn't think of it as defined strictly, or even most importantly, along gender lines. They viewed sexuality in terms of dominant and submissive, or, more crassly, the one doing the fucking and the one being fucked. This was also heavily tied to their public life and roles, as well. It was normal for men to sleep with other men, so long as the older man in a position of authority over the other man was the dominant partner in the relationship. For example, if a senator had a relationship with a young assistant, or a general had a relationship with a lieutenant, that would not be seen as scandalous. However, if the roles were reversed, say the lieutenant were the one penetrating the general, that would be incredibly scandalous. Another thing to add on to this is that these were incredibly misogynistic cultures. So while it was normal for two men to be in a sexual relationship, under the conditions I described above, women were always the submissive partner in a sexual relationship. It was incredibly scandalous for two women to sleep together because that would be two submissive partners. Finally, sexual relationships and marriage were not quite as connected as we see them today. Sure, technically, you weren't supposed to have sex with anyone other than your spouse, but men quite regularly slept with many partners of both genders without much controversy. Men would have sexual relationships with both men and women outside their marriage. You were supposed to be discreet with your dalliances, and not carry on long-term relationships with someone else when you were married, but that, too, was regularly ignored. Again, though, touching back on the misogyny, if a woman were to cheat on her husband, that would be grounds for divorce. Marriage was always between a man and a woman. So even if a man had a relationship with another man, marriage between two men, or two women for that matter, was just incompatible with how they thought about marriage. That's not to say there weren't examples of men having long-term permanent romantic relationships with other men, just that they would never have considered marriage as a possibility or something they wanted. Now there were certainly people we would consider homosexual. The 2nd century Roman Emperor Hadrian, for example, was absolutely a homosexual. He had a long-term romantic and sexual relationship with a man, much younger than him, by the way. He had a wife, but that was more for political and public image reasons than anything romantic or sexual. They had no children, and the ancient sources even suggest they never even had sex. The only thing that was notable about Hadrian's sexuality in his time is how public he was about carrying on a sexual relationship with someone other than his wife. Hitler didn't become a monster because he was kicked out of art school. He was a neckbeard bouncing around Vienna filling his head with all sorts of bullshit philosophy and well on his way to becoming a monster when someone suggested that he look into an art and architecture program at some school. He made a half-assed application which was denied, and he continued to sell little paintings to get by while he read all his crazy books. He trumped up the kicked out of art school story in Mein Kampf. People today live twice as long, on average, as people half a century ago. It was 33 in the Middle Ages and over 65 today. While technically true, it's not because people live twice as long. It's because less infants die. Without all the zeros factored in, the average has risen, even though people live roughly the same amount of time. Factor out infant mortality, and the increase is relatively minor, more like 60 versus 65. I always heard that Hitler was vegetarian, but it's actually a lie. Goebbels had this idea to make Hitler more friendly. Nazi propaganda is still efficient today. Napoleon Bonaparte was short. He wasn't exactly. He was reported to be slightly over 5 feet 2 inches by 3 different French peers when asked, but the French inch was around 2.7 centimeters instead of 2.54 centimeters. This would mean that he was, in fact, 5 feet 5 inches 5 feet 7 inches or 169 centimeters, which at the times was barely an inch, or a couple cm, shorter than the average. The idea that he was short was due to English propaganda birthed by a James Gilray, basically an 18th century comic drawer. Edit. Remind me why the imperial system is still a thing, please. That carrots improve your eyesight. Back in World War II, the British got hands on radar technology, allowing them to see enemy planes further ahead and air raiding sooner. Also helping him getting those planes out of the air. Now nobody wanted the Nazis to have this information, so the government made up this fact that British eat a lot of carrots and that it's improving their eyesight. Reading the comments in this thread made me realize two things. Some lies told back then were told so well that people many years later still believe said lies, and that we are awfully ignorant and have an underwhelming amount of context for a lot of the history we know or don't know. Edit. Hopefully fixed grammar, and wow, one of my most liked comments, and it's about the obviousness of humanity's ignorance. Not surprising lol. That corsets were uncomfortable for women and they moved organs and made women faint. Women wore corsets for hundreds of years. They were the precursor to the bra. They were for support, they were not solidly boned, they were actually quite flexible. All women wore them, high ladies of society, working women, old women, young women. They can actually be quite comfortable. The myths that most people know stem from very high ladies of fashion. Corsetry and tight lacing are two different things. Most women did not have 18 inches waists. Just like today, the women that were placed in ads are skinny and unattainable. People were not shaped differently. That France surrenders at everything. France has the highest count of victories though.